in York region， in York region，so 他做了16年的约克区教育局的 director， 所以他是最好的。If today anybody who wants to apply for Kennedy University, yeah, UT University of Waterloo, Shanghai is the best one. Yeah, he will give a little bit about Kennedy University, and Alex will give the topic about how to apply for U.S. American University, I believe. OK. 那我们今天Alex就正式给大伙开讲了，我非常感谢他专程赶回来，然后我当然要特别感谢的这个就是有一个人呢，我们在给儿子鼓掌之前，先给爸爸鼓个掌，好吧？我们这个Alex的爸爸啊，我们的陈爸啊，我们还是先给爸爸鼓个掌啊，有爸爸才有儿子，对吧？然后他爸爸是我非常好的朋友，我们俩的办公室叫隔窗相望。你在710是吧？7030啊，7030哪一个房间？208，大家记住啊，7030208房间啊，找我们的Alex是我见过在加拿大这边做家族办公室做的最好的，这个是我最喜欢的一类男性啊，就是上海男性啊，这个上海啊，这个和咱山东人是不一样的，和我们北方人不一样，上海人是非常好的，这个非常棒。然后我们俩也交流过很多，我们俩有去年年底讲过一场叫腾爸联手讲啊。他讲的也非常棒，他讲Alex整个成长过程当中，因为我觉得Alex是别人家的孩子啊，他是大学的时候人家是加州理工早入，这可不容易的。然后呢，毕业以后创业，那创业是非常不容易的，但是人家现在GPT Zero， 大家有多少人用过 GPT Zero？Is there anybody who using GPT Zero？ Yeah, okay, yeah, good, great, yeah. 还有 who is the GPT Zero user? Okay, you are the second one. Oh my god. Okay, great.Oh my god, yeah, 他在用 GPT Zero. Okay, see, you have 3 users. So yeah, so the talk should be free because you have 3 users here. Okay, yeah, so just everybody should using GPT Zero and actually let everybody know what's GPT Zero. 他自己创业，现在 GPT Zero 市值1个亿美金啊！哇哦，天哪，这真的是我们下一代的骄傲，所以我们给Alex一个热烈掌声啊！哇哦 ，yes.
Great, thank you very much.And it's a pleasure to be here. Really appreciate the invitation. For me, I really love getting the opportunity to, prior to where I am now, I always feel like there's so many things that I wish I could tell myself from when I was younger. And so hopefully this is my way of doing that. Let's see if I can full screen here.
I think you can using that one actually. I'm not sure. Okay.
Oh, the clicker?
Yeah.
Sure. I think for my purposes, you probably just go to window. See if there's one. If not, that's it. Okay, that's fine. I think there's a shortcut, but I don't know it. Okay, so today I'll be talking about, as this title says, how to be a star student in high school and get accepted to elite universities. So, as a preface, I think we want to understand, I'm going to kind of cut straight to a lot of strategy in this talk. I think there's a lot of more important things like why do I want to go to a top university that we're not really covering today. And so I think it's important to understand that because it's not just a goal that you abstractly hold, right? For me, I think I was lucky from a young age. I had a lot of mentors and role models that really inspired me to want to put in all the effort to pursue this goal and dream. And so without that, that's really the foundation. But assuming that you're here, sounds like you're already very motivated. And so let's talk a little bit about what was instrumental in my mind for me to build the foundation and skill set to get into a great university and more importantly just hit goals that I found important to me in life. So we're going to talk about 7 topics today. One is the first, I would say 4 are about really the foundation that you lay in high school, and the last 3 are really more about strategy, how you go about navigating the university landscape. So let's talk about one, setting big goals. So I think it's very important to have goals that really give you direction. And I think this is underlooked because we focus so much on the process of like, I need to get good grades because then that will mean I'm successful in the future. But really, it's not clear like why you're doing something. If you don't know why, then it's very hard to actually find the straight line. And so I think it's really important for yourself to have a really big goal. And like that's like seems kind of obvious, right? But I actually think this is something that you need to find in yourself that really motivates you. It's the reason you wake up in the morning. And once you have something like that, everything else, and it actually changed a lot. Right? That's another thing you'll notice. And so it's not so important that the goal is necessarily the correct one to begin with, but it helps you structure your life. Now you have medium goals, you have small goals that you can build towards, that you feel like you're making progress towards. And I mean, in some cases, you want to make your life almost like a video game, right, as much as possible. Like, how can I track my progress and know where I'm going? So some of the goals that I had back when I was in high school, in grade 9, I wanted to be the most knowledgeable, the most skillful debater on my debate team. Next, when I realized that I was actually not very good at debate, or I felt stuck, I changed. I said, well, I'm going to run for captain. And then actually, I didn't get elected captain. So but then my goal became, that's okay. I'm going to enact my platform to make improvements at my high school, even though I wasn't elected captain. I just felt very motivated to show people that I was a man of my word. My last goal, and this is the one that actually came to fruition, where I feel, because I had the experience of pursuing goals, I was able to get this for real, is I wanted to become one of the best 4 high school chemists in Canada. And throughout the course of 2 years, I was able to achieve that. And fortunately, be on Team Canada for the International Chemistry Olympiad. And so I think this is definitely true as well. I didn't even think of myself as someone who could achieve that last goal. And actually, I remember before going to the national qualifiers, my dad sat me down and he's like, Alex, you're gonna come out of this and you're gonna make Team Canada. You need to believe in yourself. And I think that was really important for me because during that time, we were in the competition. There were a lot of times when I think everyone had some self-doubt. And so having the motivation to carry through, to believe in yourself, even when you don't think you're gonna win. No one thought I was gonna actually become one of the top 4. But I think unless you believe in yourself first that you can do it, you won't take those extra steps, the extra hustle to make it happen. So let's say you have a goal, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the right one today, but it's something that gets you motivated. Let's talk about creating positive habits. So while goals give you the direction, I think habits give you that momentum, the ability to keep going after it day after day. And so I think one of the core habits that you'll need to process now that you're in high school or beyond is being able to schedule your day. Instead of letting the day be planned for you, right? Now everything is so open, it's abstract. You have free time in high school and you have to choose what you're gonna do with it. And so I remember in high school, there's this workshop on how to schedule your time. And I went and I was the only one there. And I was so surprised because I felt this is such an important skill. For me, I get distracted, I get to procrastinate, I play computer games. I was really bad at doing this. And so until I was able to figure this out, I was not able to fit in all my extracurriculars, my grades, even time to have fun. And so it's very simple, but very few people do it, I think, starting in high school. And so I would highly encourage you to follow these steps. Write down what you have to get done. Plan how it's going to take. Plan your breaks. Here are some other tips that I found helpful. Find your optimal study location. So I was not able to study properly when I was at home. I would get very distracted by my TV, my computer, my parents. And so I would coop myself up until 8:30 at the library, public library, for most days. Pack dinner or buy dinner or whatever. And I was able to get an extra 2 hours of work done every single day just because I felt, watching everyone around me, everyone else is working, I felt very motivated. And it was so easy, it's not like I had to pull myself into doing this. And so for you, your place might be at home, it might be in a cafe. I would say find your optimal workplace. I think also find a place where you can be without distraction and time. So whether that's early in the morning, many people late at night, to do focused work. And then finally, schedule break time so that you don't feel the need. Everyone needs break, okay? And so having a packed day is not realistic. Eventually you're gonna break down, right? And so you have to kind of organize, manage your willpower so that okay, a break is coming. That way I don't need to check my phone right now because there's nothing to worry about, it's gonna get done. So with those in mind, let's talk a little bit about exploring your interests, right? Especially in today's world, probably many of the jobs that you're going to be doing don't even exist yet. And so it might be a little difficult to plan your career, but I do think it is important to understand at a base level, what's the capacity that you like to operate in, and I'll try to explain what I mean. So I think here's a good case study here because every year in high school, basically, my interests changed. So, today, a couple of years ago, I was a first-year university student at California Institute of Technology, competitive school. And I did chemistry Olympiad. I had a social justice organization. I was on student council. That was my portfolio. Okay, that was what I applied with. But as a lot of different things before I understood and figured out what was right for me, what could I put my energy into, and I think there's this nice little triangle of okay, what am I good at? What does the world need? And what do I enjoy doing? And your goal is really to find that. So, I tried debating, Model UN, even my organization didn't do well, and so on and so forth. I tried everything, and had a lot of failures along the way. So, I think it is important to fail. I was really motivated. One of my coworkers told me in her ballet class, they had a day every week where you had to fall. And that's the day where they learned the most, right? Because they're pushing themselves, trying things that didn't feel natural. And so that's going to be normal from now on. You need to kind of be putting yourself out there. And I think from doing so, you'll actually end up finding some of the things that you really love and that motivate you. So what are some of the ways you can do this? I think there's a lot of different ways. There's fortunately, for high schoolers, I think there's just so many initiatives, groups, competitions that you can join, try, that are just kind of waiting there to be tackled. I think for me, the two things in particular is don't feel like you have to look at this alone, right? Talk to your school teachers, guidance counselors, talk to some of the accomplished people in your school, maybe people who are older than you, not really competing against them in anything, and see what did they do, right? How did they find the things that where they excelled in, and at the same time, don't feel like you need to hold on, bang your head against the wall and do something that doesn't feel So this was my list from a couple years ago of some of the things that I thought were like really cool, worth doing, from math and science to activism, business competitions, kind of politics, legal competitions, and so on. But I'm sure at this point there are many more. I think some of the notable ones now are hackathons for people who are interested in computer science. There are a ton of hackathons focused high school students where you can build projects, apps, getting internship, something that I felt the need to do, which is also feel like if you don't think any of these things are something you're interested in, or you don't feel like competing, you would rather start something new, I think that's actually a really great goal to have as well. And so what's great is, in a club in high school, it's kind of like starting a company, but you don't need any revenue. You don't have to pay your employees anything. So it's actually really great because you can just try whatever. For me, I found this, there was this lack of education-focused activism in high schools in general. And based on this, me and a few friends created a activism club that was focused on building experiential education. Essentially, how can we put people, get them feel the problems that people in poor countries are feeling. Why do they have these struggles? Why can't they develop their economy? What's stopping them, right? And so I think that was really great. We found this need, and we all really felt passionate about this. It's one of the things I was really proud of doing back in high school. And so, I think that's all I have to say about that. By the way, before I continue, if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and let me know. And if you want to speak Chinese, that's also okay.
Chinese is better.
Yeah.
Because for the live stream, they remind us is the English, so some problem maybe.
Yeah.
If you can speak Mandarin, that's better.
I'll say that's one of the things I'm still working on is my Mandarin.
His Mandarin is so. It's
No problem.
But it's okay.
Fine
It's okay.
together.
Yeah. So yeah, I think good enough. It's okay. Yeah, most of the parents and all the kids they can understand English. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Oh, okay. It's okay. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, no problem. No problem.
Great. So, of course, leave the quote up here. I think if you failed, you learn something new about the world. So, that I think is one of the best capacities you can have is your attitude towards failure. Great. So now that you found something, maybe you try something new, try a few things. How do you develop your passion? How do you bring it to a level that is going to demonstrate your qualities as a person, right? And I kind of looking forward. I say this because I think one of the things that top universities are looking for, especially ones that are very competitive, whether they're programs in Canada or the U.S., is your ability to execute at a really high level. And so you can imagine yourself, I'm a university, let's say you're a college counselor, right? You want to build a program that's the best in the country. How do you do that? And what kind of people are you looking for? So I think overall, I see a lot of high school students stretching themselves very, very thin and doing actually too much. And I think this is not really a good idea when you're approaching mid to late high school. I think it's much better for you to invest yourself in 2 to 3 activities that can really be impactful. So let's talk a little bit about preparing your plan for success. So let's say you know what you want to do. Maybe you have an inkling, or you've tried it for a year and you really think this is something I can enjoy. I think it's important to think about a couple strategies. So how do I get to being the best in this? Whether it's a competition, or let's say I want to host like the best event or build the best project. I think it's very difficult because there's not a lot of experiences of others. I think one of the best skills you can have is having the ability to reach up to the people who are more advanced than you, who are older than you, who have kind of done it already, and learn from their experiences. I think this will be relevant from when you're in university to when you're in your career and so on. I think also it's good to kind of be responsible for your own progress. You need to set goals, set deadlines, take action, and then finally learn to balance your homework and extracurriculars. And I say this because at the top level, it's weird, but homework, everyone has good grades at the very high level. And so I think the reason I say this is, the difference depends on what you're applying for. But between a 96 and a 99 is probably smaller, that means less, than having a small achievement to really great achievement when it comes to some of the US universities. And so for me, that came down to how can I do homework efficiently? I guess when I say that, that probably means people are using AI. We didn't have that back then. We were just avoiding distractions, being focused, and being able to balance extracurriculars. Okay, so next, this is kind of like a lot of people have been saying this these days in the business world, actually. Sergey Brin, the founder of Google, said this recently. Of course, other tech CEOs have been saying this all the time. And I think it's kind of like, it's somewhat true. So I think it's important to know that, to be in these schools that have such a low acceptance rate, 5%, 3%, that also means these people who are getting in, they're working at the top. They're the 3, 5, 1% most hardworking people in their schools, right? I think most of what it takes to get in is putting in hustle, but I think, of course, the other half is working smart, and that's why we're here today. So, of course, I think one of the things is, and I don't know if this has changed, but in high school, I think it's very cool to not work hard, to be very chill, and I think that's very cool until you're 24, then it's not. And not just success for success sake, but because they're able to act on really ambitious dreams, okay? In high school, being very cool, very chill, but then not be able to achieve your long-term success. And I think, and to even, at a place that was a really good school, UTS, right, private school, I think a lot of people didn't really push themselves to excel. I think a lot of people, whether for one reason or another, are okay just kind of skating along, right? Which I think it's important to remember, it's still important to be happy doing that exceptional person and maybe putting a bit more effort in than your peers. Because ultimately, what's exciting, I think, is that us as individuals, people who are really succeeding, are able to do more and more every year. Where I am at, working on startups, the startups that are really succeeding these days, they can be a billion-dollar company with just 20 people if they work correctly and push themselves. And the same thing, I think, extends to high school. Working harder than most of your peers, I think, can yield really good results. And then lastly, not to say you should pick and choose who your friends are based on their drive, but I think surrounding yourself with really smart people, whether it's being in clubs where a lot of motivated people are, or making one with motivated people, I think that is just a really easy way to make yourself feel more motivated. I think a lot of willpower is just strategy. How can I put myself in the right time, the right place, the right people to feel motivated? And then, all right, what does that mean? What does that look like? And so, I think there's actually people. what is it? It's like, so I think that hides a lot of what's truly going on. And actually, I think universities care about the underlying personal achievements that you're making in your life. So let's talk not so much on the objective, but the process. What changed in you or developed in you that allowed you to achieve that objective achievement? So a few examples, you feel like you pour your blood, sweat, and tears into solving a problem. You step outside your comfort zone, or you change the way you objective achievements, right? So before I go into a list of some of these objective achievements, I think this is really important because as we'll talk about, this helps to form the foundation of an application essay. And so reflecting on what it is that led you to be where you are today or in the future is really of objective achievements that I saw from some of my friends who went to top achievements in the arts and athletics and science or math. Maybe they were a leader and they were school captain, or they led a really successful math or science team. Maybe they did research. So they participated in ISAF and did some really cool project that made it to the national level. So I think it's the majority of the people I saw going to top U.S. universities from my school were doing something like this. And I think this is good perspective to have because it's for many of these top U.S. universities, it's not just good in, like, it's not as unique to just be a very well-rounded person who, kind of does good stuff in all areas of their life. And this is why I talk about, starting broad, focusing, and really drilling down and trying to focus yourself on something. And actually, some of these things are not easy. Sometimes for yourself, it's like finding opportunity. Like I knew from a young age, I was not going to make national level math like in my life, right? I remember being a grade 10. I was in a math class with like these grade 7 people, and they were like whipping me and the CMO, Canadian Math Olympiad problems, and I was just like, okay, obviously I'm not gonna beat these guys. So definitely, I think it took a bit of exploration to find something where there's a natural fit. But I think really in applying yourself, there are not that many students in many of these categories that you're really competing against who are as focused, as dedicated, as resourceful as you are. And so some of these things are not as bad as they might seem. But before we dwell on that for too long, I also want to focus on examples of personal achievement. So a few others that weren't mentioned already, I think owning up to a mistake, rectifying it, kind of showing a lot of character, pulling together disorganized or unmotivated team, and being a leader when no one else wanted to be. Going beyond your you probably have. So I think one thing, and I just start with this because I also think this is true. be as competitive in terms of the average output of Canadian programs. Additionally, there are a lot and employers love these universities, and so it's really good because a lot of universities they want a diverse international crowd, and so by applying so yes, the conclusion is I think you can find great Canadian programs. For example, our interns for our company, we get like 1,000 people applying for each intern position just because it's a crazy job market. The majority of our interns come from Canadian universities, even though we also accept US interns. And the reason why is we just found the talent is way better. They're trained way better. And we're bringing Toronto to do internships. The interns from Waterloo are better on average than the ones I'm getting. In addition, this is something that a lot of people don't look into unless they really focus on it, but you can get tens of thousands of scholarships, dollars from Canadian universities if you're a top achiever. And so my friends who are really skilled or talented, they're not just getting into University of Toronto, they're getting in with like massive scholarships. Some of them pay for the entire stay and tuition. And so these are like pretty well recognized. They get you in meetings and mentorship from top leaders in Canada. And so don't think that that's, because ultimately that's kind of some of the things we're after, right? Like how do we get exposed to the best people, the best opportunities? So some of those do exist. That being said, I think this was also something that impressed upon me, is that the Ivy League like schools in the US, they can be cheaper than places, Canadian universities, when you consider the financial aid. Actually, I think, not accounting for any scholarships, this is true for many of my friends who went to top US universities. You could up to 100%, but even maybe 30%, depending on the exchange rate, can be like completely paid for, stay and tuition by the university. I remember during COVID, I think, Caltech almost paid entirely for my accommodations and so on. So, or if you apply to a school that is not at the tier like 1, but I think not a lot of people actually know that. We'll talk about early admissions, early decision. You can apply for some universities early. Many of them only allow you to apply for one school early and are bonding. So if you get in, you're not allowed to apply anywhere else. And so let me do some research and digging to see what's the most up-to-date statistics on these universities. But I remember this was like kind of cool for someone who's interested in science. You can actually apply to UChicago, MIT, Caltech, and Berkeley all early at the same time, not binding. And so, if you find that's what I did partially, is a great opportunity for people who are interested in math and science. Yeah, and so I think if you do your research, it will really pay off because the most successful startups, right? Like ideas other people think are stupid. And in the middle, that's like where the best startups are. So I actually think the same thing goes for some of your life's opportunities. Okay, so finally, how do you take all the amazing work that you've done and put it together to create great impression? Yeah. So I'll talk about all the components just a little quickly. And so I think the essay is very misunderstood. So for myself, as I was born in Canada, I had a very good upbringing, and it was hard for me to pull, like, how do I write a story about my life? It just seems very, and it very often leads to a great essay, is to put together this pipeline of what was your challenge? How did that lead to personal growth? How did that lead to some marked personal achievement? And finally, how did that ultimately lead to your objective achievement? I think this is a great story because it demonstrates that you not only are a strong achiever. There are many of these people, but people who only go after accomplishments often are not the best people for a top university because I think there's less curiosity, innovation, generosity, and people who are only doing things for the sake of getting an achievement, right? Universities want someone who's going to make the entire institution a better place, who's going to leave a legacy, and their alumni community who's going to give back to the university. And I think for them, it's important to see we're admitting the best people, and that comes from both their skill set and their mentality. So let's say, this is kind of the way I write my essays. Now, let's say you wrote a first draft, you have the story. How can I find guidance in writing a good essay? I would say your teachers, your trusted family to revise your essays. Look online for inspiration. There's a lot of examples from books. Actually, to plug in, this happened just this year. GPT-0, we released a essay feedback AI. So you, it's not for the purpose of this presentation, but you can put in your essay, and we'll try to give you feedback on how to make it better. And it's for the most part free to use. So that's another way you can do it. I'm sure there's other AI examples of this elsewhere. But ultimately, AI is not able to write a very good essay. Like to make it unique and interesting and impressive, you kind of have to do it yourself. And this is also because I think universities are looking to see if this essay seems overly AI generated. Just being an AI detection company, I think I would know that actually this is something universities care about. So definitely don't go AI direction. Next, you need to get recommendation letters. And so this is not something that you just do in grade 12. You think of, oh, who's a teacher I got a really good grade in, and then I ask them, right? Actually, I think for the best recommendation letters, this starts earlier and it's more deep. You want recommendation letters from people who want to say, this was one of the top students I've ever taught, or this student shows immense passion for their work and their peers. And I think there are a couple ways, it's not just like being, how do you do that, right? Like these are just teachers. It's not like you spend that much time. So I think one, obviously, is being a star student in class. Two is finding ways to support other students, whether it's curriculars. Let's say you start your own club, get them to be your teacher supervisor and kind of plan and strategize with them. Or they're mentoring, another club that already exists, where they're the teacher that organizes a competition, right? Like those are going to be great teachers to write letters for you. And so it's important for them to show that you're really excited to learn beyond the course material, you're motivated, right? You're spending that lunchtime, after school time with them, and I think that's going to lead to great letters. Before you ask them to write a letter, I would say give them your resume, your activity list. Maybe life is busy enough as it is. Yeah, I think this is really important. Great, and then I think for standardized tests, I always recommend to try it a little earlier than you need, because that can help you de-stress. Just one thing that you don't have to focus on in grade 11 and 12, which is going to be really busy, right? I think there are a couple ways to do it. Some people learn better from a class. Some people learn better from a prep book. I would say these exams in general are pretty practicable, and you can do better. And so practicing is a great idea. For me, I think I did the SAT 3 times, and this was just to improve my writing score. The scores from the other 2 tests were fine. I don't feel regardless, the focus here is not to get like 800 in everything. I would say, depending on what school you're applying for, with Caltech, right? I had 800 in math and science and SAT 2s as well. And then my writing was a 720. So I think it's not so important that these are top of the line. If you look at the medians and for these schools, it's never like 800 is the median, right? Like that's actually above average. So these are really just used to disqualify people as opposed to qualifying them for the school. And then I think something that I've heard from a few admissions officers is also important to take the hardest version of the courses that your school offers in the subject that you're focusing on. So if it's AP Calculus or it's AP English, or IB. But let's say your school doesn't offer any of those. If it's honors, I think that's mostly what they care about. Is they actually don't care, I think, too much about the grades, beyond the fact that they're good. But I think that's the only criteria. Cool. And then of course, I'm almost done. 45 minutes has passed. The last thing is, I think your personal growth determines your success in life, not the university ranking that you go to. And now that I've graduated a couple years, I see people who are succeeding in aspects of their life. I think that's more and more true. So I have lastly a little exercise, but I think we might be out of time. So it goes down to what I was talking about at the beginning. Really, you need a strong foundation of knowing, kind of collecting and synthesizing what motivates me, right? Like, why go through all of this suffering and learning and achievement to do this on life, and that kept me going. But other than that,
然后送一个爸爸啊，所以来，我先来用美颜 ，Yeah， I want to use Yeah, I want to introduce you and your dad. Yeah, actually, yeah, that's our 26 years anniversary.
Wow.
Yeah, so I give one to you. It looks beautiful on you. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The smell.
One,
Yes.
2, 3. One more. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Wow. 太棒了。It is a great job, actually. I think it's totally different than the last time online, right?
absolutely.
Yeah, you add so many useful and valuable information. Oh my God. Yeah, the best students is the best students. OK， 非常感谢啊，真的是讲的非常好。我们再一次给我们的年轻人一个掌声，好吗？OK， 太优秀了啊，真的是这样。然后爸爸呢，想说几句，爸爸觉得。